Hello, hello, and how are you today? I think I must say the same thing every time. I'm sorry about that, but hey, it works. That's how it goes. I'm just going to fiddle for a moment with my camera setting because it looks kind of blown out a little bit. Sorry about that. I did have a bit of a go at this earlier on, but obviously not enough. Other option. Not that. Not that. I will be done in a minute. I don't know. That'll do. Whatever. I was looking at a video the other day and it actually looked a lot better than what the rest of them do. And I don't know what the settings were on that. Seriously. Anyway, doesn't matter. We're currently reading Heidi, written in the 19th century, in the 1800s. Yes, the 1800s, I think. And what about it? We're about just over halfway through, 2/3 of the way through. Heidi has just returned to the mountain after living in Frankfurt for a little while with a friend, kind of. And I'm going to show you a map to show how far away from home it was. I think she was about 10 years old at the time. There you go. There's Germany and, sorry, that one. There's Frankfurt. And where she was from is over here somewhere. Below Liechtenstein, about there where my finger is, below the L on Liechtenstein. So she was in the mountain area up here. That's where she was used to living, up in the mountains, and maybe occasionally visiting the actual village, which was also up in the mountains, not even down in the town in the valley. And then she was taken from up in the mountains through the village and down to the town to catch the train over here to here, which is where Basel is, Basel, something like that, and then catching the train all the way up here, and by the way, that is Belgium, not the Netherlands, all the way up here, all the way up here, all the way up here to Frankfurt. It was a couple of days away from home at the time. They went by train to one place and then had to stay there overnight, and then they travelled on by train to the next place. And so her aunt telling her, you could go home when you want to, wasn't really true, was it? Poor little thing. Never lived away from home after having been living with the grandfather all that time. Such a culture shock. No training for this sort of life whatsoever. And she hadn't been to school or anything like that at this stage. Hi, Jonathan. And so for her, it was just such a major thing to be there and living with people who expected her to know what she was meant to do, but she'd never been trained that way. Because when you live in a hunter's hut up in the mountains, you don't really need city table manners, do you? Not really, no. And not especially not when you're a small child. And on top of that, she didn't know how to read. She hadn't learnt to read, and the teacher didn't think that she was capable of learning to read, because all he would do was he would start by giving her the history of letters and the background as to where the letter had come into usage from and the way it was pronounced and stuff, rather than just this symbol here makes this sound, and showing her how she could use it. Eventually she did learn to read. Anyway, so we're going to be carrying on. She's back in the mountains again because she got rather ill, just so homesick. She was sleepwalking and it could have got dangerous. And so the doctor in the end said, no, enough of this. She needs to go back home so that she can get healthy again. Otherwise, you're in big trouble. And I think good on him for saying that. Anyway, hi. I'm for those of you who are new, who haven't met me before, I'm Jev. I'm in NZ, also known as New Zealand, and I read old-fashioned children's stories. And so we are about 2/3 of the way through Heidi, and we are about to continue. So I shall read. Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 15, A Great Disappointment. When autumn came, Clara was not so well. Remember, she'd been told that she could go and stay with Heidi, and Heidi has received a letter to say that she is coming to stay for a visit. When autumn came, Clara was not so well, and the doctor advised Mr. Sesamon to postpone the visit to Heidi until the following spring. I know how you hate to deny your child anything, especially this trip that she has so set her heart upon, said the kind-hearted old doctor, but you must make up your mind to it, Sesamon. Clara has not had such a bad summer as this last one for years. We don't actually quite know why she's basically bedridden or in a wheelchair or something like that and unable to walk. We just know that apparently her health is quite frail. Only the worst results would follow from the fatigue of such a journey, and it is out of the question for her. If we want to give the child a chance of recovery, we must use the utmost care and watchfulness. Mr. Sesamon, who had listened to the doctor in sad and submissive silence, now suddenly jumped up. Doctor, he said, tell me truly, have you really any hope for her final recovery? The doctor shrugged his shoulders. Very little, he replied quietly, but friend, think of my trouble. You still have a beloved child to look for you and greet you on your return home. You do not come back to an empty house and sit down to a solitary meal. The once bright and cheery doctor was now a broken-hearted man. He could not get over the loss of his daughter, who had died some months before, and who had been his sole and constant companion for many years. Mr. Sesamon, who had been striding up and down the room, suddenly paused beside his friend, and laying his hand on his shoulder, said, Doctor, I have an idea. How would it be for you to go and pay Heidi a visit in our name? You need a change of scene. I cannot bear to see you so sad. You are no longer the same man. The doctor was taken aback at this sudden proposal and wanted to make objections, but his friend gave him no time to say anything. He was so delighted with his idea that he seized the doctor by the arm and drew him into Clara's room. She held out her hand to him as he came up to her. He took a seat beside her, and her father also drew up his chair. And taking Clara's hand, he began to talk to her of the Swiss journey and how he himself had looked forward to it. He passed as quickly as he could over the main point that it was now impossible for her to undertake it, for he dreaded the tears that would follow. But he went on without pause to tell her of his new plan, and dwelt on the great benefit it would be to his friend if he could be persuaded to take this holiday. The tears were indeed swimming in the blue eyes, although Clara struggled to keep them down for her father's sake. But it was a bitter disappointment to give up the journey, the thought of which had been her only joy and solace during the long, lonely hours of her illness. She knew, however, that her father would never refuse her a thing unless he was certain it would be harmful for her. So she swallowed her tears as well as she could, and turned her thoughts to the one hope still left to her. Taking the doctor's hand and stroking it, she said pleadingly, Dear doctor, you will go and see Heidi, won't you? And then you can come and tell me all about it, what it is like up there, and what Heidi and the grandfather and Peter and the goats do all day. I know them all so well, and then you can take what I want to send to Heidi. I have thought about it all, and also something for the grandmother. Do pray go, dear doctor, and I will take as much cod liver oil as you like. In those days, cod liver oil was used as a catch-all sort of a medication when nothing else could be thought of to aid someone's healing. You gave them cod liver oil. There's probably some minerals and things in it that they may have been missing, so it may have actually done some good. It probably wouldn't have done them any bad, which was why, okay, it's safe. Yeah, take some cod liver oil. Whether this promise finally decided the doctor, it is impossible to say, but it is certain that he smiled and said, Then I must certainly go, Clara, for you will then get as plump and as strong as your father and I wish to see you. And have you decided when I am to start? Tomorrow morning, early if possible, replied Clara. Yes, she is right, put in Mr. Sesamon. The sun is shining and the sky is blue, and there is no time to be lost. It is a pity to miss a single one of these days on the mountain. The doctor could not help laughing. You will be reproaching me next for not being there already. Well, I must go and make arrangements for getting off. He's probably got to get somebody to work on his behalf as well. But Clara would not let him go until she had given him endless messages for Heidi and had explained all that he was to look at, so as to give her an exact description on his return. This was partly why she wanted to go, was to see where Heidi had come from, where she was living, all these things that Heidi had talked about when Heidi was living with her, because she was keeping her company. And that's partly, I think, why she's not been so well again, is being on her own and being bored and having nothing to distract her, and so she was focusing on things that probably weren't the healthiest. She would pack the presents she had already bought and send them to his house later that day. The doctor promised to obey Clara's directions in every particular. He would start sometime during the following day, if not the first thing in the morning, and would bring back a faithful account of his experiences and of all he saw and heard. He was hastening off when he met Miss Rottenmeier, just returning from a walk. He informed her of his intended journey, begging her in his most conciliatory voice to pack up the parcels for Heidi, as she alone knew how to pack. And then he took his leave. Don't know that was a good idea. Clara quite expected to have a long tussle with Miss Rottenmeier before she would get the latter to consent to sending all the things that she had collected as presents for Heidi, but this time she was mistaken, for Miss Rottenmeier was in more than usually good temper. She cleared the large table so that all the things for Heidi could be spread out upon it and packed under Clara's own eyes. It was no light job, for the presents were of all shapes and sizes. First there was the little warm cloak with a hood, which had been designed by Clara herself, in order that Heidi, during the coming winter, might be able to go and see grandmother when she liked, and not have to wait till her grandfather could take her, wrapped up in a sack, to keep her from freezing. Then came a thick warm shawl for the grandmother, in which she could wrap herself well up and not feel the cold when the wind came sweeping in such terrible gusts round the house. The next object was the large box full of cakes. These were also for the grandmother, that she might have something to eat with her coffee besides bread. An immense sausage was the next article. This had been originally intended for Peter, who never had anything but bread and cheese, but Clara had altered her mind, fearing that in his delight he might eat it all up at once and make himself ill. So she arranged to send it to Brigitte, who could take some for herself and the grandmother, and give Peter his portion out by degrees. Brigitte is the grandmother's daughter, I think, but Peter's mother. I'm not sure if it's the grandmother's daughter or her daughter-in-law. Anyway, it's just the three of them in their little shepherd's hut. A packet of tobacco was a present for grandfather, who was so fond of his pipe as he sat resting in the evening. Finally, there was a whole lot of mysterious little bags and parcels and boxes, which Clara had had especial pleasure in collecting, as each was to be a joyful surprise for Heidi. As she opened it, the work came to an end at last, and Clara eyed the big box with pleasure, picturing Heidi's exclamations and jumps of joy and surprise when the huge parcel arrived at the hut. Sebastian came in and, lifting the package onto his shoulder, carried it off to be forwarded at once to the doctor's house. And I'm going to have a break because that's the end of the chapter. That was a short one, wasn't it? Now, I didn't say it to you before. Did you bring your drink to keep you hydrated? I've got mine. I hope you've got yours. And do you have some nice yummy snacks to keep you going and somewhere comfortable to sit while you're listening? Even if you're working while you're listening, that's okay. I'll be able to carry on a lot quicker than usual just because it was such a short, sorry, I've got an itchy ear at the moment, just because it was such a short chapter. And we shall carry on. Whew, sorry, a little bit warm. Now, chapter 16, Heidi by Johanna Spyri. Chapter 16, The Doctor Comes with Presents. The early light of morning lay rosy red upon the mountains, and a fresh breeze rustled through the fir trees and set their ancient branches waving to and fro. The sound awoke Heidi, and she jumped out of bed and dressed herself as quickly as she could. When she went down her ladder, she found her grandfather had already left the hut. He He was standing outside looking at the sky and examining the landscape as he did every morning to see what sort of weather it was going to be. Little pink clouds were floating over the sky that was growing brighter and bluer with every minute, while the heights and the meadowlands were turning gold under the rising sun, which was just appearing above the topmost peaks. "Oh, how beautiful, how beautiful! Good morning, grandfather," cried Heidi, running out. "What? You are awake already, are you?" he answered, giving her a morning greeting. Then Heidi ran around to the fir trees to enjoy the sound she loved so well, and with every fresh gust of wind came roaring through their branches, she gave a fresh jump and cry of delight. And I'm thinking that is this picture here. I shall just show you. That one there, Heidi dancing around under the trees, the fir trees that are up behind the hut. That's grandfather there, and there's Heidi, and then there's the trees. There's a bit of a mountainside in the background up there. I'd never make a good weather person on TV where you work against a blue screen and you have to point in the right place. Anyway, where are we up to? Meanwhile, the grandfather had gone to milk the goats. This done, he brushed and washed them, ready for their mountain excursion, and brought them out of their shed. As soon as Heidi caught sight of them, she ran and embraced them, and they bleated in return while they vied with each other in showing their affection by poking their heads against her and trying which could get nearest her. When the lively little bear gave rather too violent a thrust, she only said, "No, little bear, you are pushing like the great Turk," and little bear immediately drew back his head and left off his rough attention, while little swan lifted her head and put on an expression as much as to say, "No one shall ever accuse me of behaving like the great Turk." Peter's whistle was heard, and all the goats came along, leaping and springing, and Heidi soon found herself surrounded by the whole flock, pushed this way and that by their obstreperous greetings. But at last she managed to get through them to where Snowflake was standing, for the young goat had in vain striven to reach her. Obstreperous, is that a word that you know? That's a word that I know from when I was growing up. You can look that one up. Obstreperous. Obstreperous. It's a good word. Anyway, we'll carry on. Snowflake was standing because the young goat had in vain striven to reach her, because Snowflake's not pushy. Peter now gave a last tremendous whistle in order to startle the goats and drive them off, for he wanted to get near himself to say something to Heidi. The goats sprang aside and he came up to her. "Can you come out with me today?" he asked, evidently unwilling to hear her refuse. "I'm afraid I cannot, Peter," she answered. "I am expecting them every minute from Frankfurt, and I must be at home when they come." "You have said the same thing for days now," grumbled Peter. "I must continue to say it till they come," replied Heidi. "How can you think, Peter, that I would be away when they came? As if I could do such a thing." "They would find Uncle at home," he answered with a snarling voice. But at this moment the grandfather's stentorian voice was heard. "Why is the army not marching forward? Is it the field marshal who is missing, or some of the troops?" Whereupon Peter turned and went off, swinging his stick round so that it whistled through the air, and the goats, who understood the signal, started at full trot for their mountain pasture. Peter followed in their wake. Since Heidi had come back to her grandfather, she had learned to do many things about the house. She put her bed in order every morning, patting and stroking it till she had got it perfectly smooth and flat. Her bed's made out of hay underneath her sheets. Then she went about the room downstairs and put each chair back in its place, and if she found anything lying about, she put it in the cupboard. After that she fetched a duster, climbed on a chair, and rubbed the table till it shone again. When the grandfather came in later, he would look round well pleased and say to himself, "We look like Sunday every day now." Heidi did not go abroad for nothing. After Peter had departed, she and her grandfather had breakfasted. Heidi began, and she and her grandfather had breakfasted. Heidi began her daily work as usual, but she did not get on with it very fast. It was so lovely out of doors today, and every minute something happened to interrupt her in her work. Now it was a bright beam of sun shining cheerfully through the open window and seeming to say, "Come out, Heidi, come out." Heidi felt she could not stay indoors, and she ran out in answer to the call. The sunlight lay sparkling on everything round the hut, and on all the mountains and far away along the valley, and the grass slopes looked so golden and inviting that she was obliged to sit down for a few minutes and look about her. Then she suddenly remembered that her stool was left standing in the middle of the floor, and that the table had not been rubbed, and she jumped up and ran inside again. But it was not long before the fir trees began their old song. Heidi felt it in all her limbs, and again the desire to run outside was irresistible, and she was off to play and leap to the tune of the waving branches. The grandfather, who was busy in his workshed, stepped out from time to time, smiling to watch her at her gambols. He had just gone back to his work on one of these occasions when Heidi called out, "Grandfather, grandfather, come, come." He stepped quickly out, almost afraid something had happened to the child, but he saw her running towards where the mountain path descended, crying, they are coming, and the doctor is in front of them." Oops. Heidi rushed forward to welcome her old friend, who held out his hands in greeting to her. When she came up to him, she clung to his outstretched arm and exclaimed in the joy of her heart, "Good morning, doctor, and thank you ever so many times." Isn't that lovely? I'll carry on. Yes, I will. Sorry. "God bless you, child. What have you got to thank me for?" asked the doctor, smiling. "For being at home again with grandfather," the child explained. The doctor's face brightened as if a sudden ray of sunshine had passed across it. He had not expected such a reception as this. He had quite thought that Heidi would have forgotten him. She had seen so little of him, and he had felt rather like one bearing a message of disappointment, which he hasn't given her yet. But instead here was Heidi, her eyes dancing for joy and full of gratitude and affection, clinging to the arm of her kind friend. He took her by the hand with fatherly tenderness. "Take me now to your grandfather, Heidi, and show me where you live." But Heidi still remained standing looking down the path, with a questioning gaze. "Where are Clara and grandmother?" she asked. "Ah, now I have something to tell you, something which you will be as sorry about as I am," answered the doctor. "You see, Heidi, I have come alone. Clara was very ill and could not travel, and so the grandmother stayed behind too. But next spring, when the days grow warm and long again, they are coming here for certain." Heidi stood motionless for a second or two, overcome by the unexpected disappointment. She suddenly remembered that the doctor had really come anyway. She lifted her eyes and saw the sad expression in his as he looked down at her. She had never seen him with that look on his face when she was in Frankfurt. It went to Heidi's heart. She could not bear to see anybody unhappy, especially her dear doctor. No doubt it was because Clara and grandmother could not come, and so she began to think how best she might console him. "Oh, it won't be very long to wait for spring, and then they will be sure to come," she said in a reassuring voice. "Time passes very quickly with us, and then they will be able to stay longer when they are here." Yes, because it's not going into the cold season, it's warming up. "And Clara will be pleased at that. Now let us go and find grandfather." He hasn't told her yet about his own daughter. Hand in hand with her friend, she climbed up to the hut. She was so anxious to make the doctor happy again that she began once more assuring him that the winter passed quickly on the mountain and that summer would be back again before they knew it. And she became so convinced of the truth of her own words that she called out quite cheerfully to her grandfather as they approached, "They have not come today, but they will be here in a very short time." The doctor was no stranger to the grandfather, for the child had talked to him so much about her friend. The old man held out his hand to his guest in friendly greeting. Then the two men sat down in front of the hut. The doctor whispered to Heidi that there was something being brought up the mountain which had travelled with him from Frankfurt, and which would give her even more pleasure than seeing him. Heidi got into a great state of excitement on hearing this, wondering what it could be. The old man urged the doctor to spend as many of the beautiful autumn days on the mountain as he could, and at least to come up whenever it was fine. He could not offer him a lodging, as he had no place to put him. He advised the doctor, however, to not go back to Ragaz, but to stay in Dorfli, where there was a clean, tidy little inn. So Ragaz is probably the town that's further down below Dorfli, which is the village. Then the doctor could come up every morning, which would do him no end of good, and if he liked, he, the grandfather, would act as his guide to any part of the mountains he would like to see. The doctor was delighted with this proposal, and it was settled that it should be as the grandfather suggested. Alm Uncle now rose and went indoors, returning in a few minutes, with a table which he placed in front of the seat. "There, Heidi, now run in and bring us what we want for the table," he said. "The doctor must take us as he finds us. If the food is plain, he will acknowledge that the dining room is pleasant." "I should think so indeed," replied the doctor as he as he looked down over the sunlit valley, "and I accept the kind invitation. Everything must taste good up here." Heidi ran backwards and forwards as busy as a bee and brought out everything she could find in the cupboard. The grandfather, meanwhile, had been preparing the meal and now appeared with a steaming jug of milk and golden brown toasted cheese. Then he cut some thin slices from the meat he had cured himself in the pure air, and the doctor enjoyed his dinner better than he had for a whole year past. "Our Clara must certainly come up here," he said. "It would make her quite a different person, and if she could eat for any length of time, as I have today, she would grow plumper than anyone has ever known her before." As he spoke, a man was seen coming up the path, carrying a large package on his back. When he reached the hut, he threw it on the ground and drew in 2 or 3 good breaths of the mountain air. "Ah, here's what travelled with me from Frankfurt," said the doctor, rising, and he went up to the package and began undoing it. Heidi looked on in great expectation. I'm guessing it's probably a bit like, bigger than a banana box, more like a tea chest, which most of you probably have never seen. I remember seeing them because we used to use them when we moved house. They're quite a lot bigger than a banana box. He began undoing it, Heidi looking on in great expectation. After he had released it from its heavy outer covering, "There, child," he said, "now you can go on unpacking your treasures yourself." Heidi undid her presents one by one until they were all displayed. She could not speak for wonder and delight. Not till the doctor opened the large box to show Heidi. Sorry, I've got something. I think it's a fly. I'm not sure. Hopefully it's not an ant because they just keep crawling, tickling my knee. Not till the doctor opened the large box to show Heidi the cakes that were for the grandmother to eat with her coffee did she at last give a cry of joy, exclaiming, "Now grandmother will have nice things to eat." And she wanted to pack everything up again and start at once to give them to her, but the grandfather said he should walk down with the doctor that evening, and she would go with them and take the things. Heidi next found the packet of tobacco, which she ran and gave to her grandfather. He was so pleased with it that he immediately filled his pipe with some, and the 2 men then sat down together, the smoke curling up from their pipes, as they talked of all kinds of things, while Heidi continued to examine first one and then another of her presents. Suddenly she ran up to them and, standing in front of the doctor, waited there till there was a pause in the conversation, then said, "No, the presents have not given me more pleasure than seeing you, doctor." The 2 men could not help laughing, and the doctor answered that he should never have thought it. He's used to city kids who like receiving gifts and don't necessarily value people quite so much. But Heidi, the way she's grown up, she values people, good people. As the sun began to sink behind the mountains, the doctor rose, thinking it time to return to Dorfli and seek for quarters. The grandfather carried the cakes and the shawl and the large sausage, and the doctor took Heidi's hand as they all three started down the mountain. Arrived at Peter's home, Heidi bid the others goodbye. She was to wait at grandmother's till her grandfather, who was going on to Dorfley with his guest, returned for her. As the doctor shook hands with her, she asked, "Would you like to come out with the goats tomorrow morning?" For she could think of no greater treat to offer him. "Agreed," answered the doctor. "We will go together." Heidi now ran in to the grandmother. She first, with some effort, managed to carry in the box of cakes. Then she ran out again and brought in the sausage, for her grandfather had put the presents down by the door. And then a third time for the shawl. She placed them as close as she could to the grandmother, so that the latter might be able to feel them and understand what was there. The shawl she laid over the old woman's knees. "They are all from Frankfurt, from Clara and Grandmamma," she explained to the astonished grandmother and Brigitte, the latter having watched her dragging in all the heavy things, unable to imagine what was happening. "And you are very pleased with the cakes, aren't you, grandmother? Taste how soft they are," said Heidi over and over again, to which the grandmother continued to answer, "Yes, yes, Heidi, I should think so. What kind people they must be." And then she would pass her hand over the thick, warm shawl and add, "This will be beautiful for the cold winter. I never thought I should ever have such a splendid thing as this to put on." Heidi could not help feeling some surprise at the grandmother seeming to take more pleasure in the shawl than the cakes. Meanwhile, Brigitte stood gazing at the sausage with almost an expression of awe. She had hardly in her life seen such a monster sausage. It's like what we would call salami. Much less owned one, and she could scarcely believe her eyes. Peter came tumbling in at this minute. "Uncle is just behind me. He is coming," he began, and then stopped short, for his eye had caught sight of the sausage, and he was too much taken aback to say more. But Heidi understood that her grandfather was near, and so said goodbye to grandmother. The old man now never passed the door without going in to wish the old woman good day, and she liked to hear his footstep approaching, for he always had a cheery word for her. But today it was growing late for Heidi, who was always up with the lark, and the grandfather would never let her go to bed after hours, so this evening he only called out "Good night" through the open door, and started home at once with the child, and the two climbed under the starlit sky back to their peaceful dwelling. And that's the end of that chapter. And I shall read more in a minute. Time for a drink break. The next one's a lot longer. Oh my goodness. That's better. Throat can get a little bit dry when you're reading. It's just the way it is. Not a problem. But it's a good idea to keep yourself hydrated. It's very good for your brain. If you haven't had enough water, you can't think as clearly. And I know that sounds a little bit weird, but it's true. If I'm having trouble thinking something through, if I stop and think about how long ago it has been since I last had a decent drink of water, often it's longer than I thought, and that's what I need. So I'll have a drink, and then I'll actually be fine. It also helps the rest of your body to work well. And we want to be sharp thinking and healthy and all those things, don't we? Anyway, we'll carry on. Sorry, just having a quick look at something on my other monitor just in case it's something I need to be aware of. Oh, something's tickling my leg again. But that's not a problem. And then we shall carry on. Right, here we go. Heidi by Johanna Spyri, Chapter 17, Excursions over the Mountains. The next morning the doctor climbed up from Dorfley with Peter and the goats, because Peter goes down to the village to collect the goats from the villagers to take them up for the mountain grazing. Are you, no, not quite. Peter and the goats. At the hut they found Heidi awaiting them with her 2 goats, all 3 as fresh and lively as the morning sun among the mountains. "Are you coming today?" said Peter, repeating the words with which he daily greeted her. "Of course I am, if the doctor is coming too," replied Heidi. Peter cast a sidelong glance at the doctor. The grandfather now came out with the dinner bag, and after bidding good day to the doctor, he went up to Peter and slung it over his neck. It was heavier than usual, for Alm Uncle had added some meat today, as he thought the doctor might like to have his lunch out of doors with the children. Peter gave a grin, for he felt sure there was something extra good in it. And so the ascent began. The goats, as usual, came thronging round Heidi, each trying to be nearest her, until at last she stood still and said, "Now you must go on in front and behave properly, and not keep on turning back and pushing and poking me, for I want to talk to the doctor." This is Heidi to the goats. By degrees she managed to make her way out from among them and joined the doctor, who took her by the hand. Heidi had a great deal to say about the goats and their peculiarities, and about the flowers and the rocks and the birds, and so they clambered on and reached their resting place before they were aware. Peter had sent a good many unfriendly glances towards the doctor on the way up, which might have quite alarmed the latter if he had happened to notice them, which fortunately he did not. Heidi led her friend to her favourite spot where she was accustomed to sit and enjoy the beauty around her. The doctor followed her example and took his seat beside her on the warm grass. The great snowfield sparkled in the bright sunlight on the rocky peaks. A soft, light morning breeze blew deliciously across the mountain, gently stirring the bluebells that still remained of the summer's wealth of flowers, their slender heads nodding cheerfully in the sunshine. These are mountain bluebells. They have a very, very, very thin stem, and then the flower is a little bigger compared with the size of the stem, and so they look almost like they're floating in the air as the breeze moves them. They're quite lovely, quite lovely. Overhead the great bird was flying round and round in wide circles. Heidi looked about her her first at one thing and then at another. Her eyes were alight with joy. She turned to her friend to see if he too were enjoying the beauty. The doctor had been sitting thoughtfully gazing about him. As he met her glad bright eyes, "Yes, Heidi," he responded, "I see how lovely it all is, but tell me, if one brings a sad heart up here, how may it be healed so that it can rejoice in all this beauty?" "But no one is sad up here, only in Frankfurt," exclaimed Heidi. The doctor smiled, then growing serious again, he continued, "But supposing one is not able to leave all the sadness behind at Frankfurt, can you tell me anything that will help then?" "When you do not know what more to do, you must go and tell everything to God," answered Heidi with decision. "Ah, that is a good thought of yours, Heidi," said the doctor, "but if it is God himself who has sent the trouble, what can we say to him then?" Heidi sat pondering for a while. She was sure in her heart that God could help out of every trouble. She thought over her own experiences and then found her answer. "Then you must wait," she said, "and keep on saying to yourself, 'God certainly knows of some happiness for us, which he is going to bring out of the trouble. Only we must have patience and not run away.'" Yes, that was something that she'd actually learnt for herself, wasn't it? "That is a beautiful faith, child, and be sure you hold it fast," replied the doctor. "But can you understand, Heidi, that a man may sit here with such a shadow over his eyes that he cannot feel and enjoy the beauty round him, while the heart grows doubly sad knowing how beautiful it could be? Can you understand that?" A pain shot through the child's young, happy heart. The shadow over the eyes brought to her remembrance the grandmother who would never again be able to see the sunlight and the beauty up here. This was Heidi's great sorrow, which reawoke each time she thought about the darkness. "Yes, I can understand it, and I know this, that when one must say one of grandmother's hymns, that then one must say one of grandmother's hymns, which bring the light back a little and often make it so bright for her that she is quite happy again. Grandmother herself told me this." Which hymns are they, Heidi? Asked the doctor. I only know the one about the sun and the beautiful garden, and some of the verses of the long one which are favourites with her, and she always likes me to read them to her 2 or 3 times over, replied Heidi. Well, say the verses to me then. I should like to hear them too, said the doctor. Heidi collected her thoughts for a second or two and began, Let not your heart be troubled, nor fear your soul dismay. There is a wise defender, and he will be your stay. Where you have failed he conquers, see how the foeman flies, and all your tribulation is turned to glad surprise. If for a while it seemeth his mercy is withdrawn, that he no longer careth, for he is for his wandering child forlorn. Doubt not his great compassion, his love can never tire. To those who wait in patience, he gives their heart's desire. Suddenly she paused. She was not sure if the doctor was still listening. He was sitting motionless with his hand before his eyes. His thoughts had carried him back to a long past time. He saw himself as a little boy, standing by his dear mother's chair. She had an arm around his neck and was saying the very verses to him that Heidi had just recited, words which he had not heard now for years. He could hear his mother's voice and see her loving eyes resting upon him, and as Heidi ceased, the old dear voice seemed to be saying other things to him, and the words he heard again must have carried him far, far away, for it was a long time before he stirred or took his hand from his eyes. When at last he roused himself, he met Heidi's eyes looking wonderingly at him. Heidi, he said, taking the child's hand in his, that was a beautiful hymn of yours, and there was a happier ring in his voice as he spoke. We will come out here together another day, and you will let me hear it again. Peter, meanwhile, had been giving vent to his anger. Peter is jealous. He doesn't want anyone taking his friend away, and he doesn't want to share her. I don't know if he actually understands that it's only because of the doctor that Heidi is back. But we'll find out. We'll carry on reading. Sorry. Peter, meanwhile, had been giving vent to his anger. It was now some days since Heidi had been out with him, and when at last she did come, there she sat the whole time beside the old gentleman, and Peter could not get a word in with her. He got into a terrible temper, and at last went and stood some way back behind the doctor where the latter could not see him, and doubling his fist made imaginary hits at the enemy. Presently he doubled both fists, and the longer Heidi stayed beside the gentleman, the more fiercely did he threaten with them. Meanwhile, the sun had risen to the height which Peter knew pointed to the dinner hour. All of a sudden he called at the top of his voice, "It's dinner time!" Heidi started for the dinner bag so that the doctor might eat his where he sat, but he stopped her, telling her he was not hungry at all and only cared for a glass of milk, as he wanted to climb up a little higher. Then Heidi found that she also was not hungry and only wanted milk, and she should like, she said, to take the doctor up to the large moss-covered rock where Greenfinch had nearly jumped down and killed herself. So she ran and explained matters to Peter, telling him to go and get milk for the two. Peter seemed hardly to understand. "Who's going to eat what is in the bag, then?" he asked. "You can have it," she answered, "only first make haste and get the milk." Peter had seldom performed any task more promptly, for he thought of the bag and its contents, which now belonged to him. As soon as the other two were sitting quietly drinking their milk, he opened it and quite trembled for joy at the sight of the meat, and he was just putting his hand in to draw it out, when something seemed to hold him back. His conscience smote him at the remembrance of how he had stood with his doubled fists behind the doctor, who was giving up to him his whole good dinner. He felt as if he could not now enjoy it, but all at once he jumped up and ran back to the spot where he had stood before, and there held up his open hands as a sign that he had no longer any wish to use them as fists, and kept them up until he felt he had made amends for his past conduct. Then he rushed back and sat down, to the double enjoyment of a clear conscience and unusually satisfying meal. Heidi and the doctor climbed and talked for a long while, until the latter said it was time for him to be going back, and no doubt Heidi would like to go and be with her goats. But Heidi would not hear of this, and then, as the doctor would have to go the whole way down the mountain alone, she insisted. No, but Heidi would not hear of this, as then the doctor would have to go the whole way down the mountain alone. She insisted on accompanying him as far as the grandfather's hut, or even a little further. She kept hold of her friend's hand the whole time, and the whole way she entertained him with accounts of this thing and that, but at last the doctor insisted on her going back. So they bid each other good night, and the doctor continued his descent, turning now and again to look back, and each time he saw Heidi standing on the same spot and waving her hand to him. Even so, in the old days, had his own dear little daughter watched him when he went from home. It was a bright, sunny autumn month. The doctor came up to the hut every morning, and thence made excursions over the mountain. Elm Uncle accompanied him on some of his higher ascents. The doctor found great pleasure in his companion's conversation, and was astonished at his knowledge of the plants that grew on the mountain. He was well versed also in the ways of the animals, great and small, and had many amusing anecdotes to tell of these dwellers in caves and holes, and the tops of the fir trees. And so the time passed pleasantly and quickly for the doctor, who seldom said good-bye to the old man at the end of the day without adding, "I never leave you, friend, without having learnt something new from you." On some of the very finest days, however, the doctor would wander out again with Heidi, and then the two would sit together as on the first day, and the child would repeat her hymns and tell the doctor things which she alone knew. Peter sat at a little distance from them, but he was now quite reconciled in spirit, and gave vent to no angry pantomime. September had drawn to its close, and one morning the doctor appeared looking less cheerful than usual. It was his last day, he said, as he must return to Frankfurt, but he was grieved at having to say good-bye to the mountain, which had begun to feel quite like home to him. Elm Uncle, on his side, greatly regretted the departure of his guest, and Heidi had been accustomed for so long to see her good friend every day that she could hardly believe the time had suddenly come to separate. She walked part way down the mountain with him, still unable to grasp the idea that he was going for good. After some distance, the doctor stood still, and passing his hand over the child's curly head, said, "Now, Heidi, you must go back, and I must say good-bye. If only I could take you with me to Frankfurt and keep you there." The picture of Frankfurt rose before the child's eyes, its endless rows of houses, its hard streets, and even the vision of Miss Rottermeier and Tinette, and she answered hesitatingly, "I would rather that you came back to us." "Yes, you are right. That would be better. But now, good-bye, Heidi." The child put her hand in his and looked up at him. The kind eyes, looking down on her, had tears in them. Then the doctor tore himself away and quickly continued his descent. Heidi remained standing without moving. The friendly eyes with the tears in them had gone to her heart. All at once she burst into tears and started running as fast as she could after the departing figure, calling out in broken tones, "Doctor, doctor!" He turned round and waited till the child reached him. The tears were streaming down her face, and she sobbed out, "I will come to Frankfurt with you now at once, and I will stay with you as long as you like. Only I must just run back and tell grandfather." The doctor laid his hand on her and tried to calm her excitement. "No, no, dear child," he said kindly, "not now. You must stay for the present until the fir trees, under the fir trees. You might get sick again. But if I am ever ill and alone, will you come then and stay with me? May I know that there would then be someone to look after me and care for me?" "Yes, yes, I will come the very day you send for me, and I love you nearly as much as grandfather," replied Heidi, who had not yet got over her distress. And so the doctor again bid her good-bye and started on his way, while Heidi remained looking after him and waving her hand as long as a speck of him could be seen. As the doctor turned for the last time and looked back at the waving Heidi and the sunny mountain, he said to himself, "It is good to be up there, good for body and soul, and a man might learn how to be happy once more." And that's the end of that chapter. It's not quite as long as I thought it was because somebody forgot to put a marker in for where the chapter was in the page indexing thing. Whatever it is. The thingamajig. I don't know what it's called. Don't ask me. Anyway. Drink of water. Because it's an ebook, the chapter breaks are coded into it for where the chapters are. But somebody missed that one. Oh, sorry, itchy nose. No, I haven't been playing with the cat. Not this time. I did say hello to him earlier, but not this time with playing with him. Right. I'm going to carry on. But I am quickly going to have a little look here. Okay, that's right. I'm just checking on when the next set of pictures are. Right. I'm reading Heidi by Johanna Spyri, and this is chapter 18, A New Home for the Winter. We'll read on and find out. I have no idea. It's been quite a long time since I read this book. I remember big parts of it, but not all the details. Anyway, we shall carry on. Alm Uncle had kept his word and was not spending the winter in his old home. That's what it is, I forgot. It was something he had talked about with the pastor, remember? As soon as the snow began to fall, he had shut up the hut and the outside buildings and gone down to Dorfley with Heidi and the goats. Near the church was a straggling, half-ruined building which had once been the home... Sorry, excuse me. Which had once been the home of a distinguished soldier. It was rented to poor people who paid but a small sum, and when any part of the building fell, it was allowed to remain fallen. As soon as the grandfather had made up his mind to spend the winter in Dorfley, he rented the old place and worked during the autumn to get it sound and tight, weather-tight. In the middle of October, he and Heidi took up their residence there, so obviously the wintry weather was starting to happen more strongly. On approaching the house from the back, one came first to an open space with a wall on either side, of which one was half in ruins. Above this rose the arch of an old window, thickly overgrown with ivy, which spread out over the remains of a domed roof that had evidently been part of a chapel. A large hall came next, which lay open without doors to the square outside. Very much a ruined house. Here also walls and roof only partially remained, and indeed what was left of the roof looked as if it might fall at any minute, had it not been for two stout pillars that supported it. Alm Uncle had here put up a wooden partition and covered the floor with straw, for this was to be the goats' house, because he's not leaving them up in the shed all winter, not on their own. Endless passages led from this, through the rents of which fabric has been rent or torn, the rents of which the sky as well as the fields and the roads outside could be seen at intervals, but at last one came to a stout oak door that led into a room that stood intact. Here the walls and the dark wainscoting remained as good as ever. Wainscoting is timber work on the walls, and it usually goes up to a certain height, around the height of the back of a chair, so that when you push the chair back it doesn't damage the plaster, it bumps up against the wood. And wainscoting is the panelling that's on the lower part of the wall so that the wall doesn't get damaged. Here the walls and the dark wainscoting remained as good as ever, and in the corner was an immense stove reaching nearly to the ceiling, on the white tiles of which were painted large pictures in blue. These represented old castles surrounded with trees, and huntsmen riding out with their hounds, or else a quiet lake scene with broad oak trees and a man fishing. A seat ran all around the stove so that one could sit at one's ease and study the pictures. These attracted Heidi's attention at once, and she had no sooner arrived with her grandfather than she ran and seated herself and began to examine them. But when she gradually worked herself round to the back, something else diverted her attention. In the large space between the stove and the wall, 4 planks had been put together as if to make a large receptacle for apples. There were no apples, however, inside, but something Heidi had no difficulty in recognizing, for it was her very own bed with its hay mattress and sheets and sack for a coverlid, just as she had it up at the hut. Heidi clapped her hands for joy and exclaimed, "Oh, grandfather, this is my room. How nice! But where are you going to sleep?" Now, I'm just going to pause here. The description of the stove, it's not as fancy, but we've just had another stove similar to this in another story. The stove in the other story was that really fancy one that August from Austria had hidden himself inside so he could go with his friend the stove that had always looked after his family by keeping them warm. And it's we don't have them in our part of the world, and I don't remember seeing them in England either when we were over there, but I have seen them in other parts of Europe, like the Netherlands and Germany and Austria, Switzerland, those sort of places. And they're a great big thing. Sometimes they're built in place and they're made with fire bricks which don't get crumbly if they get too hot, by having a fire lit next to them all the time. And then on the outside, they have tiles placed, which are easier to keep clean, but also they have these lovely pictures on and stuff like that. Sometimes they're actually made as big sections that are fitted together, and it's got thick layers, which is like the one that Auguste had. And that was in the book called The Nuremberg Stove. The Nuremberg Stove. You can look that one up on YouTube. I've done a reading of that one. Actually, I don't know if it's on there yet, but it should be soon. Anyway, it will be on YouTube soon. So here we're having another one of these stoves. This one's not as fancy though. But the idea with these stoves is you light a fire in it. You don't necessarily have to have it lit for a long, long time, but long enough to get the ceramic of the stove warmed up. And then it just radiates this heat throughout the whole of the house, or at least the decent sized room that it's in. And it keeps it so that the room stays warm without having to use lots of firewood to heat the room. And it's got a set of tubes inside the ceramic so that it actually is very efficient. It actually burns very, very well without losing all its heat up the chimney. So that's the sort of stove it is. Go and look online. You'll find pictures of ceramic stoves. Also referred to as a tile stove, but using some German name, I think, for it. Anyway, I'll carry on. "But where are you going to sleep?" Heidi asked grandfather. "Your room must be near the stove, or you will freeze," he replied, "but you can come and see mine too." Heidi got down and skipped across the large room after her grandfather, who opened a door at the further end, leading into a smaller one, which was to be his bedroom. Then came another door. Heidi pushed it open and stood amazed, for here was an immense room like a kitchen, larger than anything of the kind that Heidi had seen before. There was still plenty of work for the grandfather before this room could be finished, for here there were holes and cracks in the walls through which the wind whistled, and yet he had already nailed up so many new planks that it looked as if a lot of small cupboards had been set up around the room. He had, however, made the large old door safe with many screws and nails as a protection against the outside air, and this was very necessary, for just beyond was a mass of ruined building overgrown with tall weeds, which made a dwelling place for innumerable beetles and lizards. Heidi was very delighted with her new home, and by the morning after their arrival she knew every nook and corner, or as I'd say, nook and cranny, so thoroughly that she would take Peter over it and show him all that was to be seen. Indeed, she would not let him go till he had examined every single wonderful thing contained in it. Heidi slept soundly in her corner by the stove, but every morning when she first awoke, she still thought she was on the mountain, and that she must run outside at once to see if the fir trees were so quiet because their branches were weighted down with the thick snow. She had to look about her for some minutes before she felt quite sure where she was, and a certain sensation of trouble and oppression would come over her as she grew aware that she was not at home in the hut. But then she would hear her grandfather's voice outside, attending to the goats, and these would give one or two loud bleats as if calling to her to make haste and go to them, and then Heidi was happy again, for she knew she was still at home, and she would gladly jump out of bed and run out to the animals as quickly as she could. On the fourth morning, as soon as she saw her grandfather, she said, "I must go up to see grandmother today. She ought not to be alone so long." But the grandfather would not agree to this. "Neither today nor tomorrow can you go up," he said. "The mountain is covered fathom deep in snow." Just an aside here, a fathom is a nautical term. I have no idea why he's using this up a mountain. Nautical, of boats and the sea, and it's to do with depth of water in the ocean. And a fathom is 6 feet of water, 6 feet depth of water. So that's quite a long way. So how would a man who lives up a mountain, who does timber work and has goats and lives in a goat hut in summer, know to call it a fathom? Maybe it's a term that they've used elsewhere. I'm only familiar with it as a seafaring term. Anyway, snow, a fathom deep. And the snow is still falling. The sturdy Peter can hardly get along. A little creature like you would soon be smothered by it, and we should not be able to find you again. Wait a bit till it freezes, then you will be able to walk over the hard snow. Heidi now went to school in Dorfli and eagerly set to work to learn all that was taught her. She hardly ever saw Peter there, for as a rule he was absent. The teacher was an easy-going man who merely remarked now and then, "Peter is not turning up today again, it seems, but there is a lot of snow up on the mountain, and I dare say he cannot get along." Peter, however, always seemed able to make his way through the snow in the evening when school was over, and he then generally paid Heidi a visit. Sorry, banging something under my desk. At last, after some days, when Peter climbed out of his window one morning, the door was quite blocked by the snow outside. He was taken by surprise, for instead of sinking in the snow, he fell on the hard ground, and went sliding some way down the mountainside like a sleigh before he could stop himself. So it sounds like there's been an ever so slight warming, so the surface softens, and then it's got really cold and frozen the surface. So it's made it hard and slippery. He picked himself up and tested the hardness of the ground by stamping on it and trying with all his might to dig his heels into it, but even then he could not break off a single little splinter of ice. The elm, that's this mountainside, was frozen hard as iron. This was just what Peter had been hoping for, as he knew now that Heidi would be able to come up to see them. He quickly got back into the house, swallowed the milk which his mother had ready for him, thrust a piece of bread in his pocket and said, "I must be off to school," and in another minute was shooting down the mountain on his sled. He went like lightning, and when he reached Dorfli, which stood on the direct road to Mayenfeld, he made up his mind to go on further. So down he still went, till he reached the level ground, where the sled came to a pause of its own accord, some little way beyond Mayenfeld. He knew it was too late to get to school now, as lessons would already have begun, and it would take him a good hour to walk back to Dorfli. So he took his time about returning and reached Dorfli just as Heidi got home from school and was sitting at dinner with her grandfather. Bit of a scamp. Peter walked in, exclaiming as he stood still in the middle of the room, "She's got it now." "Got it? What?" asked the uncle. "Your words sound quite warlike, General." "The frost!" exclaimed Peter. Oh, now I can go and see grandmother, said Heidi joyfully, for she had understood Peter's words at once. But why were you not at school then? You could have come down on the sled, she added reproachfully, for it did not agree with Heidi's ideas of good behaviour to stay away when it was possible to be there. It carried me on too far and I was too late, Peter replied. I call that being a deserter, said the uncle, and deserters get their ears pulled, as you know. Peter gave a tug of his cap in alarm, for there was no one of whom he stood in so much awe as Elm Uncle. And an army leader like yourself ought to be doubly ashamed of running away, continued the Elm Uncle. What would you think of your goats if one went off his way, went off this way and another that, and refused to follow and do what was good for them? What would you do then? I should beat them, said Peter promptly. And if a boy behaved like these unruly goats and he got a beating for it, what would you say then? Serves him right, was the answer. Good, then understand this. Next time you let your sled carry you past the school when you ought to be inside at your lessons, come on to me afterwards and receive what you deserve. Peter understood the drift of the old man's questions, and that he was the boy who behaved like the unruly goats, and he looked somewhat fearfully towards the corner to see if there happened to be a stick around. But now the grandfather suddenly said in a cheerful voice, Come and sit down and have something, and afterwards Heidi shall go with you. Bring her back this evening and you will find supper waiting for you here. Peter's very motivated by food. This unexpected turn of conversation set Peter grinning all over with delight. He obeyed without hesitation and took his seat beside Heidi, but the child could not eat in her excitement at the thought of going to see grandmother. She ran to the cupboard and brought out the warm cloak Clara had sent her. With this on and the hood drawn over her head, she was all ready for her journey. She stood waiting beside Peter, and as soon as his last mouthful had disappeared, she said, Come along now. As the two walked together, Heidi had much to tell Peter of her two goats that had been so unhappy the first day in their new stall that they would not eat anything, but stood hanging their heads, not even rousing themselves to bleat. And when she asked her grandfather the reason for this, he told her it was the same with the goats as with her in Frankfurt, for it was the first time in their lives they had come down from the mountain. And you don't know what that is, Peter, unless you've felt it yourself, added Heidi. When they reached their destination, they found Brigitte sitting alone knitting, for the grandmother was not very well and had to stay in bed on account of the cold. Heidi had never before missed the old figure in her place in the corner, and she ran quickly into the next room. There lay grandmother on her little poorly covered bed, wrapped up in her warm grey shawl. Thank God, she exclaimed as Heidi came running in. The poor old woman had had a secret fear at heart all through the autumn, especially if Heidi was absent for any length of time, for Peter had told her of a strange gentleman who had come from Frankfurt and who had gone out with them and always talked to Heidi, and she had felt sure he had come to take her away again. Even when she heard he had gone off alone, she still had an idea that a messenger would be sent over from Frankfurt to take the child. Heidi went up to the side of the bed and said, Are you very ill, grandmother? No, no, child, answered the old woman reassuringly, passing her hand lovingly over the child's head. It is only the frost that has got into my bones a bit. Shall you be quite well then, directly it turns warm again? Yes, God willing, or even before that, for I want to get back to my spinning. I thought perhaps I should do a little today, but tomorrow I am sure to be all right again. Heidi noticed that the grandmother was wrapped up in her nice shawl and exclaimed, In Frankfurt everybody puts on a shawl to go out walking. Did you think it was to be worn in bed, grandmother? I put it on, dear child, to keep myself from freezing, and I am so pleased with it, for my bedclothes are not very thick. She answered, But grandmother, continued Heidi, your bed is not right because it goes downhill at your head instead of uphill. I know it, child. I can feel it. And the grandmother put her hand to the thin, flat pillow, which was little more than a board under her head, to make herself more comfortable. The pillow was never very thick, and I have lain on it now for so many years that it has grown quite flat. Oh, if only I had asked Clara to let me take away my Frankfurt bed, said Heidi. I had 3 large pillows, one above the other, so that I could hardly sleep. And I used to slip down to try and find a flat place, and then I had to pull myself up again because it's proper to sleep there like that. Could you sleep like that, grandmother? Oh, yes. The pillows keep one warm, and it is easier to breathe when the head is high, answered grandmother. But we will not talk about that, for I have so much that the other old sick people are without, for which I thank God. There is the nice bread I get every day, and this warm wrap, and your visits, Heidi. Will you read me something today? Heidi ran into the next room to get the hymn book. Then she picked out the favourite hymns one after another, for she knew them all by heart now, and was as pleased as the grandmother to hear them again after so many days. The grandmother lay with folded hands while a smile of peace stole over the worn, troubled face, like one to whom good news has been brought. Suddenly Heidi paused. Grandmother, are you feeling quite well again already? Yes, child, I have grown better while listening to you. Read it to the end. The child read on, and when she came to the last words, as the eyes grow dim and darkness closes round, the soul grows clearer, sees the goal to which it travels, gladly feels its home is nearer. The grandmother repeated them once or twice to herself, with a look of happy expectation on her face, and Heidi took equal pleasure in them, for the picture of the beautiful sunny day of her return home rose before her eyes, and she exclaimed joyfully, Grandmother, I know exactly what it is like to go home. A little later Heidi said, It is growing dark and I must go. I am so glad to think you are quite well again. She ran into the next room and bid Peter to come quickly, for it was now grown quite dark. But when they got outside, they found the moon shining down on the white snow, and everything as clear as in daylight. Peter got his sled, put Heidi at the back, he himself sitting in front to guide, and down the mountain they shot like 2 birds darting through the air. I'm going to show you a picture now. No, not that one. It's the one that comes after that. That one. There they are, shooting down the hillside, and that's in the moonlight. Because it's now the snow surface is hard enough that they can use the sledge. When Heidi was lying that night on her high bed of hay, she thought of the grandmother on her low pillow, and of all she had said about the light and comfort that awoke in her when she heard the hymns, and she thought, if I could read to her every day, then I should go on making her better. But she knew that it would be a week, if not 2, before she would be able to go up the mountain again. This was a thought of great trouble to Heidi, and she tried to think of some way which would enable the grandmother to hear the words she loved every day. Suddenly, an idea struck her, and she was so delighted with it that she could hardly bear to wait for morning. So eager was she to begin carrying out her plan. All at once she sat upright in her bed, for she had been so busy with her thoughts that she had forgotten to say her prayers, and she never now finished her day without saying them. When she had prayed with all her heart for herself, her grandfather and grandmother, she lay back again on the warm, soft hay and slept soundly and peacefully till the morning broke. And that's the end of the chapter and today's reading. Next time we are having Heidi teaches obstinate Peter. Ooh, I think that's her solution, is to teach Peter how to read. And he probably just needs somebody to teach him in a way that makes sense and is useful to him. Anyway, so there you go. That's the end of today's reading, and I'm going to give you a couple of links that you can use. So first of all, I'm going to give you, if you're watching this on Twitch, the link I've just given you is the link for my YouTube channel, which is where the stories go 2 weeks after I've read them on Twitch. And I put them into playlists so you can listen to a whole book at a time, or in pieces if you want. But if you go over to the YouTube channel and if you subscribe, which doesn't cost you anything, and if you click on the bell there, it will tell you every time I put up a new video. And if you follow me here on Twitch, Twitch will also tell you if I put up, when I go live, so you don't miss it. And the other link I'm going to give you is to Discord. And that is where I've started to put up little bits and pieces about the stories, and where you can chat with other people who listen to the stories. It's very quiet. There's not a lot of chatting going on at the moment. Although somebody was sharing their photos of hair colouring over the years. Lots of fun. Because I've got a little bit, you can't quite see it here in this, they're just in there a little bit, sort of, kind of, there's some purple in there anyway. And so we were talking about that, and someone who helped me to do that and that sort of thing. So we'll see you next time. Don't forget, bring your water. Bye.